la bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito, nada.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 4, Unmasking Imperialism, exposing imperialist propaganda in mainstream media. Today, we're talking about the elections in Ecuador, a country I hold very dear to my heart. I love the people of Ecuador. I actually lived in Ecuador from 2017 to 2018, and I got a chance to meet some very amazing people out there and to see the progress of President Rafael Correa, the Citizens' Revolution, and also to see the downfall of Ecuadorian politics with neoliberalism, with capitalism. Recently, there was the election in Ecuador where Guillermo Lasso, a right-wing banker, was declared the victor. So we're going to be talking about the outcome of the elections in Ecuador from a revolutionary socialist perspective, to talk about the good, the bad, what could have been done better for the left in Ecuador. And I'm really honored to be joined by a good comrade who you've probably seen around, who's very active in the Ecuadorian revolutionary movement, Ramón Méndez Rivas, an activist and political analyst from Acción Revolución. Show them some love on Facebook, Twitter, IG. Acción Revolución is a collective of Ecuadorians in the U.S. diaspora that supports progressive candidates and legislation in Ecuador. How's it going, Ramón?
Hi, how you doing? Thanks for having me today. I'm very glad to be here. Ready to talk about what has been a quite sad week, but you know, this is what revolutionaries are made of. We feed off resistance. That's in our DNA. So we're here, and I'm very thankful for this invite. I'm saying hi, Amir.
No doubt, compañero Ramón. And of course, we have Camarada Zero, who's active as well with the Ecuador Solidarity Movement, active in a lot of movements in the diaspora, a true Latin American internationalist, a communist revolutionary. And my new nickname for Camarada Zero, Mr. Worldwide. He was recently in Nicaragua, recently in Colombia, now in the 305. But he's Mr. Worldwide with the anti-imperialist vibe. Camarada Zero, how's it going, brother?
Nah, it's going good, man. You took the words right out of my mouth. I'm out here in the 305 in Miami, being an anti-imperialist, building with the people out here. I mean, you already know, sometimes on the left, we already know what Miami is, you know, Gusolandia. But I mean, there's still like struggle out here. There's still, you know, working class out here and oppressed people. So we got to be in solidarity with them. But yeah, you know, I'm honored to be part of this show today with the comrade Ramon to talk about this topic with Ecuador and to really go into what happened, because things are not black and white. You know, you gotta there's a lot of gray areas to cover and there's a lot of lessons to learn for the left moving forward.
Yeah, that's a good point, Camarada Zero. And shout out to everybody who watches and listens to us in Miami. Shout out to my comrade Libre in Miami, a Troika Collective, one of the homies holding it down, and comrade Khalil as well. I have mad love for Latinos in Miami who are leftist revolutionaries, because it's a hard place to organize, and it's cool that you're getting a chance to go out there and work with a lot of people. So before we get into the recent election of Ecuador, I think it's important to give some context, historical context, because it's something that a lot of mainstream media outlets are not doing. And we're going to play some clips as well of how mainstream media has covered the elections in Ecuador, because it's been very decontextualized. It's been very removed from the historical analysis of just how bad capitalism and imperialism has devastated the nation of Ecuador. So I think, obviously, we know that Ecuador, being one of the Latin American countries, has been colonized by the Spaniards, has been a victim to US imperialism during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, especially because it's a country that's very wealthy in natural resources, one of the original quote-unquote banana republics, along with the countries that me and Camarada Zero are from, Colombia and Honduras. And it's just another example of a nation under the boot of US imperialism that has been dominated by Wall Street and London and the stock exchange of the imperialist countries. So starting off in the 90s, right, we have the era of neoliberalism dominating the world, the collapse of the Soviet Union. We have this mentality that the private sector, the market, the banks, they should run everything. And Ecuador was no exception. In the 90s, you had this class of people who Rafael Correa, the former president, would call pelucones, which I love that term. It's a funny term because it comes from the wealthy people who used to wear these wigs, the elite. These wigs were kind of like the wealthy settlers who were on the coast and Guayaquil and other parts. And so this class of pelucones or bankers or whatever you want to call them, they oversaw a huge economic crisis in the late 90s, in 1998, 1999, called the Feriado Bancario, the banker's holiday, in which Ecuador's economy was entirely tanked by these bankers. There was, in the private financial sector, the banks had distributed really risky loans and failed to maintain liquidity. It was a huge scam. They were giving out all these loans, promising this, promising that. And then one day to the next, they just dipped. They all went to Miami. They all went to Europe. They left the country. They totally fucked up the economy. And people like the Isais brothers, Roberto, William, and Estefano Isais, these three banker brothers, they stole millions of dollars from the Ecuadorian people. They left to Miami. Eventually, they were prosecuted under Correa's government. But so many people like this who left the country, who made money from scamming people through these banking schemes. Eventually, under the government of Jamil Mawad, there was severe inflation and devaluation of the Ecuadorian sucre, which was the currency of Ecuador at the time prior to the dollar. Sucre, named after one of the independence heroes of Ecuador and at the time of La Gran Colombia. And eventually, Ecuador was forced to adopt the US dollar as a national currency. Obviously, this is very devastating for the people of Ecuador to not even be able to use their own currency. Now their commodities and labor competes with the dollar in the market of Ecuador. So it's a very bad end of the deal for the working class in Ecuador. So there's huge anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist passion in Ecuador. The people have been pummeled, destroyed by neoliberalism, by capitalism, by these banking elites, these pelucones from Guayaquil, from Wall Street, from Miami. And between 2000 and 2006, we had a continuation of some of these policies of neoliberalism. You had the rise of the leftist movement in Ecuador, the indigenous movement, and you had a very powerful figure by the name of Rafael Correa, who's the president of Ecuador, who came into power in 2007. He was elected in January 2007 with the Alianza País party. And it's a very progressive party, social democratic. You know, we have, as revolutionary socialists, we have some critiques of it, but nonetheless, a good step forward for this Latin American country. And with the Citizens' Revolution, Correa was able to usher in progressive reforms in terms of healthcare, education, housing, indigenous rights, protecting the environment in the Constitution, protecting indigenous rights in the Constitution. As I mentioned earlier, I lived in Ecuador in 2017 at the end of Correa's presidency last year. And it was a very beautiful experience to see the progress, the peace, the stability of Ecuador under Correa. Granted, there was contradictions, there was problems, it wasn't perfect. But I personally spoke to a lot of people, especially on the coast, who loved Correa, who were proud of the work that the Citizens' Revolution did. Eventually, in 2017, there was Lenin Moreno, who succeeded Rafael Correa after the election against Lasso as well, who won the recent election. Lenin Moreno also came from Alianza País. However, Lenin Moreno, as many call him, the traitor, the traidor of Latin America, because he was somebody who rolled back a lot of those gains. He privatized a lot of key social programs, public programs. He initiated paquetazos, these IMF reforms, these neoliberal packages that devastated the working class. And he went and backstabbed Correa. He backstabbed the Ecuadorian people. Eventually, in 2019, there was some huge protests against Moreno and neoliberalism. The whole country was on lockdown. People were rising up, as was the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean. 2020, COVID hit Ecuador particularly bad. I'm sure we all saw some of those images of bodies of people in Guayaquil, especially where the public services that were once funded by the government, once had support by the Citizens' Revolution, were privatized. And now a lot of these medical industries failed to provide services for the people. A lot of people died, which was very unfortunate in Ecuador. And it just shows how much of a failure capitalism and neoliberalism are in handling pandemics like COVID-19. And so recently there was a selection on April 11th, the second round. This was the second round of the election. Guillermo Lasso of the right-wing Creating Opportunities Party, CREO, won the second round, defeating Andrés Arauz, representing the UNES coalition. Andrés Arauz is a leftist, progressive supporter of Rafael Correa, somebody who is actually comes from a background of economics. He's very smart. He's a very smart dude when it comes to economics. He understands 21st century socialism very well. Of course, we also have our critiques of that, and we'll go into that in a second. But Andrés Arauz basically in the second round lost to Lasso, even though in the first round Arauz had a significant lead, but not one large enough to avoid a runoff with Lasso. And the third place candidate was Jakub Perez, or as our compas in Nicaragua refer to him, Yankee Perez, because of his shady role and connections with some of the U.S. imperialists. We'll go into that as well, the role of intersectional imperialism and Yankee Perez in this election. And so that's where we're starting off. April 11th, Lasso was declared the winner. The inauguration is set for May 24th in Ecuador. And it's really important to talk about Ecuador because I think Ecuador is a country where you see all of the experiments of politics happening as we speak. We see intersectional imperialism happening with Yankee Perez. We see 21st century socialism with Arauz. We see right-wing populist neoliberalism with Lasso, all kind of heading face to face. And it's important. It's a microcosm of the different tendencies globally that are happening. And so that's just a brief overview of what happened in Ecuador recently. I wanted to give that context because it's important to do so before even talking about anything going on. Shout out to Janio Alvarado. Saludos, Camarada Ramon. I'm going to stop talking because I know I've been talking a lot. I'm going to go to a clip first of Lasso winning the election. This is a clip from France 24. This is how mainstream media is covering this election. So I'm going to play the clip. Now I want to hear from the compas here on the stream to see what your thoughts are about how mainstream media is covering it and just your thoughts on the election in general.
The third time's the charm for Guillermo Lasso. The conservative candidate declared victory in Sunday's election after 2 failed bids for president.
This is a historic day. A day when all Ecuadorians got to decide their own future. Through their vote, they expressed the need for change.
An advocate of freer markets and increased foreign investments, Lasso marks a shift away from the largely leftist policies that have dominated the presidency for over a decade. On the campaign trail, he vowed to increase the minimum wage, expand access to the labor market for youth and women, and put in place tax cuts for small businesses. Despite campaigning on a starkly different socialist platform, rival candidate Andrés Arauz congratulated Lasso on his victory, vowing to respect the democratic process.
We were fighting for differing values and ideas, but now we must move forward, build bridges, and find consensus. This is an electoral setback, but by no means is it a political or moral defeat.
Sunday's election came amid a deepening economic and health crisis in Ecuador. The country's economy, highly dependent on oil, was already weak due to low crude oil prices before the pandemic. But the coronavirus has infected more than 340,000 people, left 500,000 unemployed, and pushed a third of the population into poverty.
So that's an overview of how mainstream media is covering it. Let's start off with you, compañero Ramon. Your thoughts on this mainstream media coverage of the election and just the election in general?
Well, one thing that really stood out to me about the clip was that they mentioned that the country has been on leftist policies for over a decade, which is not true, right? Even though Lenin Moreno was the successor to Rafael Correa, formed in the same party, his former vice president, he took a hard shift to the left. So that's the first, to the right rather. So that's the first thing I would say about that. And just means, I've seen this in mainstream media. I'm glad that they mentioned that he's a conservative, a right winger, because sometimes you hear them talk like, oh, he's a liberal, and they try to use other words to mask what they're really about. So it is France 24. So I'm glad that they're mentioning that he's a conservative. But the mainstream media, if you see all around, you see CNN and Español and all other types of media, they're really jumping on, and also BBC in Spanish, they're really jumping on Lasso on this victory and trying to make it, hype it up, if you will. Right now, everyone is, if you want, the media is really taking a hit at the sulking of the Revolución Ciudadana. They kind of shell-shocked movement that it's gonna have to see internally to answer a lot of the questions as to why we lost.
That's a great point. I think that I noticed that as well, where they say ruled by 10 years of leftism. And that's exactly right. Under Lenin Moreno, it was the complete opposite. It was neoliberalism. It was the free market decides all. The state is cracked down. The state is privatized. And it's a complete inversion of reality. And they're just upholding Lasso as this hero, as this person who's going to come and save the day. And it's really disgusting to see that. But Camarada Zero, your thoughts on this clip and also just the election outcome in general?
Yeah, just like what Ramon said, like I'm glad that they said that he was conservative and that how he's going to push free market policies and basically trying to make him look like this kind of like new breath for the right in Latin America out of this whole wave of like left winning, like whether it's in Bolivia or in Chile, that trying to make it look like, oh, the right has a new way of winning elections, this like fake populism. So, it's just, it's crazy what happened. For me, I'm saddened what occurred in Ecuador, but I understood why and how this happened. But yeah, this is what we're about to break down, like why did Lasso win? And it's not just because of his policies, it's just the whole propaganda of what U.S. imperialism did within this election that we all have to take into consideration and learn from.
Yeah, that's a great point. And even failing to recognize Lasso as being part of that banking elite that has ruined the country, I think that's one of the biggest takeaways that I've seen, is that Lasso represents that very same class of pelucones, of people who destroyed the economy in the 90s. It wasn't like he was just chilling on the sidelines doing anything. He was part of sabotaging the economy. And I think one of the beautiful things that I saw in Ecuador under Rafael Correa was that he brought a sense of pride to Ecuador. I think that as someone who's from Honduras, my family's from Honduras. I was born and raised in New York. But my family's from Honduras. As another small and impoverished country in Latin America, we have to compete with the imperialist countries in terms of commodities, food, clothing, lifestyles. And a lot of that is our culture and our heritage, our music, our customs, a lot of times are erased under these neoliberal capitalist systems. And people want to abandon their national identity in favor of whatever is packaged and sold by the imperialists. And under Correa brought a sense of pride and national urgency to the country in terms of like buy Ecuadorian, eat Ecuadorian, promoting Ecuadorian nationalism, which in a progressive and anti-imperialist way, which I think is beautiful. And I think for somebody like Lasso, who represents multinational banks, he's someone who's more cosmopolitan. He's not really somebody who's firmly grounded in Ecuador the same way that people in the countryside are, I think it's really dangerous because it's a fear for me that so many customs and rights, indigenous peoples as well, will lose the culture and traditions they have in the country. What I wanted to kind of moving forward to compañero Ramon, for people who are unaware of Ecuador, right? Give us a sense of the landscape politically and racially in Ecuador, right? We have the sort of three main regions that we talk about, the Andes being mainly indigenous, La Costa, which we have like Esmeraldas with the Afro Ecuadorian population, and Guayaquil with the white settler banker population, and then the Oriente with the another indigenous population. Give us a sense of what Ecuador is like for people who haven't been there or are unaware of what it's like.
Yeah, so to the probably American eye or Americanized eye, to the Americanized eye, all of Ecuador is indigenous, if you ask, right? In the American way, with this binary, this racial binary, you can be 10% indigenous and you'll be considered indigenous. In Ecuador, it's kind of the opposite, right? You can be 50% indigenous and you'll have this other category to not be classified as indigenous. So, you know, the percentage of people in Ecuador that are actually classified as indigenous could be much larger if we use this American view of how to divide and how to cast people. But yeah, I mean, in this election specifically, the coast where I'm from voted overwhelmingly for Andrés Arauz. And along with the coast, all the way from Esmeraldas to El Oro in the south, in the border with Peru, voted for Arauz and Rabascal, who was the vice presidential candidate, along with the Sucumbíos province, which is in the Amazon. Everywhere else, including Amazon and including the Sierra region, voted for Lasso, and including Galapagos in this second round. In the first round, the Sierra region and the Amazon region overwhelmingly voted for Yankee Perez, and Lasso only won in Pichincha, which is the province that hosts the capital, which is where essentially which is essentially where the election is lost, in the capital. Those couple of million of votes make the whole difference. Everywhere else kind of voted, you know, along state line, red and blue, the same way you would think about it in the U.S. One big thing that changed in this election is that Guayaquil actually voted for Arauz, and the province of Guayas, where it's hosted, or where Guayaquil is, actually voted for Arauz, both in the first and the second round. So that's one difference, because usually it would be a right wing haven. In this case, that wasn't the case. Where I'm from, Manabí, which is between Guayas and Esmeraldas, where a huge Montubio population, which is this type of people that live and work off the land, that are kind of this indigenous, black, and white mixture, overwhelmingly voted for Arauz. It's known as the bastion of Correísmo. Some polls mention more than 70%, but as the votes already came in, it's closer to 68% in favor of Arauz. You know, that's the one province that if you take it county by county or neighborhood by neighborhood, you would actually see a crushing defeat of Lasso. Sadly, that was not the case for the rest of the country. Economically speaking, Ecuador right now it's in a recession. In the feriado bancario of 2000, the economy dropped by 8 points. Right now, it's dropping by more than 12 points. So it's even a bigger recession that the feriado bancario back in 2000 cost. That's a big highlight. So the years that are coming forward for Ecuador, whether Arauz won or now that Lasso has won apparently, are going to be dire. Now in the hands of a person that's already talking of opening up public enterprise to private takeover, saying that the state is too big, too obese, and all these other words that we often hear from the right. It's a worrying sight. It's definitely a worrying sight. One thing that I do want to mention, though, as to why perhaps there was a lot of vote for Lasso, or rather a lack of support for Arauz, what I would always say is Lasso didn't win. Arauz lost. And this is why. Lasso, in the first round, had a little bit over 19%. Arauz had over 30, around 32%. Then second place had a little bit, it was just point difference, like 0.10, 0.20 difference between Lasso and Jakub, and Yankee Perez, sorry. You also had around 19%. And then you had Hervas from the Izquierda Democrática, who got fourth place and got 15%. Izquierda Democrática, traditionally social democratic party, this candidate is more of a right wing. He is a big entrepreneur, if you will, a company owner and all that, Javier Herbas. So you already saw that the country was very well divided. It was already estimated that Correísmo's base is around 30%. So voting 32% showed a very small increase in that. You can just say that the loyalists voted for Arauz. And you can see that the country is very divided in different options. I would say that the big winner, if you ask me, was actually Yankee Perez and Javier Herbas, because they're the only two candidates that came out of this dynamic of Arauz, Lasso, or conservatism against Correísmo that actually popped out, that actually made a name for themselves, where you see the rest of the candidates got 2%, 1.5%. A lot of that vote, the Herbas vote and the Yankee Perez vote, went for Lasso, and that is undoubtedly the case. Sadly, a big part of the indigenous movement of the Conaye, whose political branch is Pachacuti, whose political party is Pachacuti, what they were divided themselves. Some supported Lasso openly, some said they weren't going to vote for either one. So they were actually advocating for not voting, for abstaining from voting. Well, as in Ecuador, voting is you're obligated to vote. They would say, vota nulo, which means like go vote so you can, have your certificate that you voted, because if not, you got to pay a fine and other type of things. But don't vote for either one. Just mess up the ballot, So that actually played a big part. But also the big voter was not only the voto nulo, which was extremely high in some provinces in the Sierra, where the indigenous population, a lot of it lie, even went up to 30% in those provinces. But also the abstention in a country like Ecuador, where you're mandated to vote. It is actually very unusual to have around 17% of abstention of this voting in the second round. You can say that's probably due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Probably people rather pay a $80 fine or $100 fine or wherever it may be, rather than to expose themselves and their family to COVID. Why? Because right now there are no beds left in Ecuadorian hospitals. There is no oxygen left. So, the situation economically and politically is very, very dire. But I will insist, Lasso did not win. Arauz and Correísmo lost this election.
Very well put, compañero Ramón. Shout out to Terry Matson, one of our good comrades who we were spending time with in Nicaragua. I have mad respect for Terry. Terry said, just returning from Quito as an election observer, Lasso didn't win, Arauz lost. Very true in my humble observation. Very true. That's a great point. And it's a good way to rephrase it, because reading mainstream media, right, that's the headline is Lasso wins. And it's not, it's the fact that Arauz, there was a sabotage against Arauz, there's sabotage against Correísmo. Camarada Zero, turning a little bit to the continental impact of this election, right? Because this is obviously part of a broader offensive of neoliberalism against left-wing populism, against left-wing anti-imperialism and nationalism. How do you think this is going to impact Latin America and the Caribbean in general, Ecuador moving to the right, especially with Colombia to the north? Peru, we have a candidate who is talking in favor of Venezuela, who's moving on to the next election. What impact do you think the Ecuador election is going to have?
Yeah, I mean, regionally wise, it's gonna have an impact. I mean, a lot of people were betting on the left that Arauz was gonna win, because Arauz spoke a lot about returning Ecuador back to UNASUR, which was a project with the first presidents of the Pink Tide being Correa, Morales, Chavez, creating a political bloc in the region. I mean, you had ALBA, but ALBA's more an economic bloc. You had UNASUR that was going to be like the European Union, of them uniting their resources. And I'm talking about having a currency, a South American currency. And people were betting for Arauz to win and for Ecuador to come back to UNASUR, and we weaken the Grupo de Lima, the Lima group out there in Peru. But now we see that, no, I mean, the right one, U.S. imperialism, knew how to throw their pennies into this election. Like they said that how this was like the revenge of the OAS for what happened in Bolivia, of how you had in Bolivia like a landslide victory from us. and it made the OAS look bad. So I guess they didn't want to have a repeat in Ecuador. So you see that how they had propaganda and how they utilized, like where my family's from, Colombia, to go have propaganda against Arauz, using the general attorney, accusing Arauz of receiving money from the ELN, of them creating this false video with like false ELN guerrillas, but it was in Ecuador, and it was seen that it was a false video because there was a bird there, and this bird doesn't exist in Colombia. So it showed how, you know, United States imperialism and their lackeys, which is Colombia, were integral in this election, as well as Lasso said about how he looked up to former right-wing president Álvaro Uribe, and said how he was a great Latin American leader. And you had like youth from Uribe's party, Centro Democrática, in Ecuador, in Quito, right next to Lasso. So for me, it shows like the future for Ecuador, as far as like, say, if the United States wants to train more paramilitaries in Ecuador to use against Venezuela. You know, that was a big thing too, what Lasso did. He also paid Venezuelan migrants out in Ecuador to like protest with pamphlets, with big pancartas, saying that if you to vote for Lasso, so Ecuador doesn't become like Venezuela. So you had a lot of that Venezuela baiting. And this is, I mean, Ecuador is going to be a chessboard now for U.S. imperialism against Venezuela. Also for the fact that now you got the funny fake president, I don't even know if he's famous anymore, but how Juan Guaido is going to come to inauguration of Lasso. So it shows a precedence about what we are going to expect under Lasso in Ecuador for the region.
Yeah, definitely. And it's sad to see, because a lot of the beautiful public works that I saw in Ecuador, the gyms, there, like when I lived in Ecuador, it was cool because there was like a free public gym a few blocks away from I used to live in Quito, and there was a huge free public gym called Cumandá. It was very beautiful, and it was constructed by Korea's government. Poor people who never had access to like sports and gyms were able to go there and enjoy that. And it's sad to know that things like that are going to get privatized and cut, and it's just a real shame. So, one last thing I also wanted to mention on that point about Lasso is it's also a representation of how the right wing is rebranding itself internationally. And I think we have to look at somebody like Steve Bannon from the US, who was Trump's top advisor in the 2016 election, who rebranded capitalism and right-wing neoliberal economics as the underdog. They rebranded it as edgy. So in Ecuador, one of the things Camarada Zero had a great point before we started the stream, that Lasso was saying stuff like, you know, I pulled myself up by the bootstraps. I'm an individual. I'm doing this from the bottom. I started from the bottom. Now we're here, you know, and he was kind of saying more controversial stuff. We saw something similar in Brazil with Bolsonaro saying outrageous stuff on social media, branding himself as the underdog, branding himself as like, you know, we're fighting against the elites. And they branded Korea and Alianza País as the elites somehow. And it's just interesting to see that from a media perspective, how people who run the global system of capitalism, of imperialism, because that's what Lasso represents, right? Lasso represents the dominant economic world order, that the private sector does good, that the state should have no role, that companies should run everything. He represents that. And to somehow convince people that that view is the underdog view, that view is the victim view, it's just crazy to see that. But moving forward, I want to spend some time talking about somebody who we've been mentioning quite a bit, Jakub Perez, aka Yankee Perez. And the reason we call him Yankee Perez is because even though on appearance, right, as Marxists, we talk about appearance versus essence, right? On appearance, he's somebody who's indigenous. He's somebody who's talking about progressivism, the environment, you know, I'm progressive. I support the oppressed people in Ecuador. But in essence, we look at some of the funding and groups that he's involved with connected to the US, connected to the NGOs, connected to the liberal wing of imperialism that seeks to attack any real anti-imperialist left in our countries. And I want to spend some time talking about who this guy is, because I think he played a much bigger role in this election that is talked about. So I want to quickly go to a clip by Al Jazeera, one of the outlets that kind of represents this liberal imperialist branding and mentality of Yankee Perez, and just get your thoughts on what you think of this clip.
For days, indigenous Ecuadorians marched to the capital, some from as far away as the Amazon rainforest, to demand a recount of this month's presidential elections.
The entire country is tired of so much corruption, bowing to manipulation and abuse. This time, we won't give in. Jakub represents resistance.
The march was led by Jakub Bettis, a center-left environmentalist and indigenous rights activist who insists he came in second place. That would allow him to compete in a presidential runoff in April.
There are no longer doubts. Fraud is no longer a presumption. It's a truth that no one can hide. It's a structural fraud, and we have the evidence here.
Bettis is commonly known by his adopted indigenous name, Jakub, which means water in Quechua. He presented the Electoral Council with boxes containing alleged proof of inconsistencies in nearly 50% of polling stations. His supporters are demanding the council order a recount of all of them, even though it has already declared conservative Guillermo Lasso the official second-place winner by less than half of a percentage point.
If they don't respect the letter of the law, millions will heed our call for a national uprising, because they can't take away the dreams of the Ecuadorian people.
It's not a threat to be taken lightly. Ecuador's combative indigenous groups are well organized and in the past have proven they can paralyze the country and even force out governments when they mobilize. The Electoral Council argues it can only challenge results from specific polling stations when there's evidence of inconsistencies. It also argues that it can't afford a massive recount. The point of this demonstration, and larger ones that may follow, is to show that refusing the demands of Ecuador's first serious indigenous presidential contender could cost the country far more. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera.
So that was, again, a clip from Al Jazeera about Yankee Perez, as we referred to him. Again, right, on appearance, you see the flags, you see the people. It seems like, yeah, let's support this. Compañero Ramon, tell us, who is Yankee Perez? Who is this? What does this guy represent? Who supports him? And what do you think, what's your position of how the left understood him?
Well, Carlos Ranulfo Perez Guardambel, which is his birth name, he has legally named it since. So, I guess I'll just call him by his last name, Mr. Perez. His blog, Pachacutic, which is the political branch of FUNAIE, also to mention, won 27 seats of the 137 seats in the National Assembly. So they are by far the second largest bloc, if you count one party only as opposed to alliances, right? First is the UNES, which is the party 1 and 5, with around 50 National Assembly members, and then 27 Pachacutic. But so just to mention that the election was very close, and like I mentioned earlier, he actually won in all the provinces in the Sierra and the Amazon, except for Carchi, which Herbas won, Sucumbíos, which Arauz won, and Pichincha, which Lasso won. So it's very odd that he's not in the second round. I'll just leave it there. But yeah, he's for whatever it's worth, I'll just leave that there, that Lasso went through and not Mr. Perez. He has been a big supporter, at least in the mainstream media, of the rights of the indigenous, of water, against mining. He really became famous. He's a lawyer by trade and has been a college professor, but he really became famous during the Correa government as the left alternative to the left, right? As Correa, he's an economist by trade, un desarrollista, specializing in development, especially of this type of countries like Ecuador. He was ready to get the economy going. He mentioned sometimes, no vamos a ser pobres sentados, Correa, no vamos a ser pobres sentados en costales de oro. We're not going to be rich people sitting on bags of gold, right? So he actually did push for a lot of the mining and that type of things, which very easily Mr. Perez jumped on the bandwagon, right? To rally against. Who doesn't want to be against mining? To be fair, President Correa did start a couple of initiatives protecting the environment, such as the dirty hand of Chevron, which wanted to take Chevron, make them accountable for all the pollution that they have done in the country of Ecuador, but also with the whole incident with the Yasuni, where he tried to create this international fund to leave untouched the Yasuni, which is a natural reserve that, as he said, it benefits the whole world as part of the Amazon rainforest, and it's kind of this natural lungs of the world. Sadly, only a couple of countries pitched in, around $300,000 out of millions and millions that were needed to avert the drilling of the Yasuni and to get that money from somewhere else. I remember Germany was actually one of the countries that did put money into the fund. So Mr. Perez really jumps in this bandwagon and kind of makes himself a martyr, fighting against the police and fighting against the government, fighting against the elite in this case, right? The new political elite. Because if we are to understand Correísmo was this very big force that overtook the government, that overtook the state, if you will, where they had virtually a perennial mandate on the National Assembly as well as the executive. So in the narrative of everyone else, the other types of left, the other branches of the left that were not in agreement with Correísmo and parts of the right wing, it was very easy to just point out and say, hey, they have all the power, they're the elites. So the right wing took very big advantage of this and co-opting Mr. Perez, or rather putting him in that place to fight Correísmo, especially because of the contradictions that are inside Correísmo, especially coming from the left. Because if you see, like you mentioned, a lot of the people who support him there are indigenous people who historically have been part of the left in Ecuador prior to Correísmo's existence, people who have been in struggle and in thrive for decades in Ecuador. So that's not to be taken away from them. Sadly, like any other party, you see these divisions, right? So in Pachacuti alone, you have 3 leaders right now, right? You have Mr. Perez, who was the candidate put there by the right wing of Pachacuti, said that by themselves, by the other leaders that were ousted, if you will, by the Poncho Dorados, or the Golden Ponchos, if you will, because that alluding to this, yeah, they're indigenous, but the other 2 leaders would be leaders would be Leonidas Issa, who led the October 2019 protests, which Perez was not around for. And also Jaime Vargas, who also led the protests of 2019. Jaime Vargas supported Arauz in the second round and in the first round, but made it officially in the second round. Perez, of course, he was a candidate. And then Leonidas Issa, who was the leader that advocated for the voto nulo. So you see that inside Pachacuti, they're divided, right? For different interests, various interests that are dividing the indigenous left. But if you will, Perez has already made comments in the past, in the 2017 election, where he openly supported Lasso against Lenin Moreno and said, we'd rather have a banker than a dictator, alluding to Correa as a dictator. So when you see that, if I'm a critique of the left and my main thing is to go with the right, as to oppose the left that I don't agree with, like I don't agree with everything that Correísmo, but I'm not gonna go with the right.
Right.
Like that just makes no sense, right? So that's when you really see what they're really about. And one thing that it's very sad, and that you see the opportunism or the arribismo of Mr. Perez, is that he was actually elected as the prefect of the province of Azuay, which is the equivalent of a U.S. governor to that province, right? And he left after a year and a half to run for president. The mandate was 4 years. Maybe if he wanted to be reelected, it would have been 8. But he left. He left that position that the people have given him, that responsibility that people have given him, to go for a higher office only a year and a half into his mandate. So that alone lets us know that his intentions were never to govern for his community, for his province, but he was just using it as a political trampoline to jump jump into, or catapult rather. In Spanish we use the word trampoline, but a political catapult to launch into the presidency. So it's this appearance of indigenous folks that really confuses, especially leftist people outside of Ecuador, right? Especially leftist people outside of Ecuador, and I would tend to say the more liberal faction of leftism. And in some cases, I will grant them that this is due to a lot of the social conservatism that has riddled inside of Correísmo. If they are anti-imperialist and more leftist in economic reforms, socially speaking, they are very conservative, or at least the conservative faction has been the ruling one. Of course, every country has their own realities and identities. You're not going to make US-style amendments or UK-style amendments to Ecuador or to Honduras. But you see that a lot of that young vote did not vote for Arauz, voted for Herbas in the first round and later on anti-Arauz. But you see that a lot of the young vote, which is just statistically speaking more socially liberal, even if they might classify themselves as libertarians or whatever, in these very key issues regarding women's rights, gay rights, same-sex marriage, and ecologism. That's where a lot of the blurred lines come into place for monsters like Mr. Perez to jump out of and claim a stake in the people's struggle.
That's a great explanation of Yankee Perez and his role, because I think that a lot of times people on the left fail to understand the new strategy, the new tactic of imperialism, starting in 1961 with the Sino-Soviet split between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. You had people like Zbigniew Brzezinski and a lot of people in Washington as well, other people in the White House who understood, like, look, there's these divisions in the left. How do we attack the left from the left? How do we attack the Soviet Union by saying that the People's Republic of China is more radical revolutionary than the Soviet Union, and pit them against each other? And at the end, it benefits imperialism. We saw the same thing happen as well in the 90s with the color revolutions against the Eastern Bloc. They were branding all of these right-wing, libertarian, pro-EU movements as revolutionary, as freedom fighters. And we see the same thing happening today in Latin America with the opposition in Venezuela. They were branded as protesters, revolutionaries. And in Ecuador's case, it's really interesting because I remember living in Ecuador, there was this group called, I think, Bloque Proletario. It was like a youth group in Quito, and they were anti-Correa. They had signs that said, like, abajo con Correa, vote for Lasso. And then there's another group, Unidad Popular, as well, that had signs that said, like, abajo con Correísmo, support, vota por Lasso. And I was like mad confused. I was like, what the fuck? Like, and it's a strategy of imperialism is to divide the left by upholding one section as like the real radical, and then attacking, the largest wing of the left as conservative, stale. We saw that as well in Tiananmen Square, how they showed like the tank as this cold machine, and then like the liberal individual in front of the tank. So it's interesting to see that, and I think you make a great analogy in the context of Ecuador. But Camarada Zero, what are your thoughts on Yankee Perez, his role in all of the left in Ecuador, and just how this relates to the conversation about intersectional imperialism in the US?
I guess Yankee Perez does his job of being the weaponization of identity politics. And we look at the era that we live under Biden after Trump, that how people could fall for this like trick, this Trojan horse of like a so-called like water protector, this indigenous guy that wears like Huipala, the rainbow flag, and starts talking all this stuff about the environment. And it demonstrates, like you said, Ramiro, about the color revolution. Like where we came from right now, from Nicaragua, in the 2018 protests, they try to do the same thing. Like they first started off with the whole environmentalist thing against like how China wanted to build a canal, and then later on with the so-called student protests. And I forgot about this part too, about how they try to divide Sandinistas, like basically how they created the MRS, the Movimiento Renovación Sandinista, which were a bunch of women that were trying to weaponize feminism against Comandante Ortega. And
right.
if you view Nicaragua, they have a 50-50 rule with gender, like, so that debunks that whole thing. But like, yeah, in this case where Ecuador, they try to use indigenous politics. They try to use the whole narrative of water protector and the whole thing about the authoritarian left. versus the alternative left. And I mean, Yankee Perez has said, like, he's criticized trade deals with China, but he said he wouldn't hesitate in signing a trade deal with the U.S. And I laugh about how he's attacked other left-leaning countries. Like, he was pro the coup against Evo Morales in 2019. He even said how Evo Morales might be an indigenous person, but how he's ignorant for supporting a colonized ideology, and that being socialism. As well as how he said about how countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua were racist, but yeah, he's celebrating 4th of July with U.S. representatives in Cuenca.
Right. Yeah, it's just complete nonsense, and it's a double standard. And I think it's a great point as well from the environmentalist perspective about green imperialism, because what it does as well, and I think compañero Ramon made a great point earlier about development, because here's the thing, in the global south, in the third world countries, people want development. They want prosperity. They want roads. And that's one of the beautiful things I saw in Ecuador under Correa is the roads. Like, they fixed like the roads before Correa. Imagine in the Andes where it's high as fuck, the altitude is tall, you're driving, it's very dangerous. And under Correa's government, it was when all these roads were paved, bridges were constructed, linking major cities. And people want progress, people want development. And so now the strategy of the synthetic left, of the liberal imperialists, is to support not development, to support going back, this kind of anarcho-primitivism of like, we need to go back to, the way we lived before, like we need to stop development. And it's a way to stop countries in the global south from trading with Russia, trading with China, trading with Iran to develop and uplift their people and to keep them in a state of poverty by being like, you're hurting the environment, even though we know that what are the countries that have done the most damage to the environment? The US, the UK, like the industrialized countries of the West. And now by using that strategy, they're preventing countries in the global south from being able to lift more people out of poverty. So it's just, there's so many levels to it. And I get frustrated with people on the left sometimes because they're just like, they just see the appearance, right? They just see this guy dressed up in a huipala and they're just like, look, he's the good guy. But moving forward, because I know it's been really dope talking with y'all, and just I know we have maybe about 10 or 15 minutes left. I wanted to ask you, comrades, about what critique you have of Arauz, of Correísmo in Ecuador as a revolutionary socialist. What do you think now that Lasso is going to be the president, now that we know all the neoliberal reforms are going to be rolled in, there's going to be more poverty, more violence against people? What is the role of the left in Ecuador moving forward? And what can we learn from the era of Correísmo, of Arauz, and what can we change to that so for moving forward so that a more revolutionary socialist process can continue? We can start with Ramon.
So I would say that the big thing, the big basic, just crucial part that's absent, not 100% absent, but truly absent inside of Correísmo is political formation, political education of the youth, of the base, of the militancia. We see the example of Venezuela, where with sanctions, with an economy in shambles, you still have that militancia strong and supporting the project. Oh, they know it's not going to be easy, but they have a vision for the country, an anti-imperialist vision, a vision that's for and by the home country. In this case, in Correísmo is not an ideology. Correísmo is more of a support for a person that did very, very good things for the country. If you look at the numbers, the numbers don't lie at the end of the day. But there is no political education. There is no clear ideology of what Correísmo is. Correísmo was born in power. Rafael Correa was never a politician. He was the minister of economy for a couple of months, quite literally a couple of months, right before he ran for the presidency. So he doesn't come organically from like the left, or he doesn't come organically from any political party, but he rather comes from this more outside academic technocratic view, of course, with anti-imperialist views, but there wasn't a quote unquote left party that supported him. Alianza País was made up of some other former vice chancellor of Ecuador, Quinto Lucas, who was a candidate for the National Assembly this time, has said, Correísmo is like a bed sheet made out of different pieces where some are red, some are blue. It's this kind of like Frente Amplio type of this broad front, but there is no clear basis of what we're standing about. Is Correísmo the Correísmo that kicked out the U.S. out of the naval base in Manta, or is this one that did the trade deal with Europe, a couple of years later, right? Is this the one that protected the Yasuni, or the one that drilled in the Yasuni? These are very general overviews, but there is no clear stance on many issues, especially like I mentioned earlier, social issues, more liberal social issues that a big part of the left identify with. That's just a fact. One thing that I do have to say though is that Correísmo has been fighting against all odds. They were not allowed to run on their own party. Alianza País was taken away from them by Lenin Moreno and other traitors, right? Other gusanos. Also, then they try to clear the Movimiento Acuerdo Nacional, MANA, which they got all the signatures for, but was not accepted by the Lenin Moreno's government, CNE. Also, then you had this alliance with Fuerza Compromiso Social, Lista 5, on which Correísmo ran for the sectional elections of, mayor, city council, and such, prefect 2 years ago. That party was not allowed to run for a presidency this time. So they had to get a different party, the Centro Democrático. I know it's kind of weird to be called Centro Democrático and be Correísta as opposed to Colombia. Right. A lot of people have been confused by that too in Ecuador. But then you had to get another party, which is historically a center-right party, Centro Democrático. And they used that party. Later on, Fuerza Compromiso Social, Lista 5 was allowed to also be on the ballot. But you also have, again, a big broad front of support that it's needed because you're fighting against every single branch of government. You're fighting against all the apparatus of the state. Then you had Correa himself trying to run as vice president, similar to what Cristina Fernández did in Argentina, but was not allowed to run for president. So then they had to get a different vice presidential candidate, which was Carlos Rabascal, and he did an amazing job. All the provinces where he was in charge of running the campaign won. That's also an internal kind of criticism of the other side, I guess. But one thing that I would have to say, though, we have in all of this context, not being allowed to run, not being allowed to have your own party. Also, the voice, the image of Rafael Correa was not allowed in the campaign. They would actually fine you and block you by the CNE, the controlling body, if you use his voice, if you use his jingles, his face, because he was not on the ballot. Of course, this was done so people wouldn't identify Arauz with Correa because he's running on a different party. He's a new politician. He has never been a mayor or an assembly member, nothing. He comes from academia, very similar role to Correa, right? Very similar profile, with a new party, with a new color. So there is no way of identifying it with Correísmo. A lot of people, especially in the rural area, still thought that Correísmo was Alianza País, 35. So you see that. So you got to fight the media. First, you just had to put in his name. Arauz is Correa. Like first, you had to put that there. Once you had that, then you could go. One big thing is that Arauz was not able to connect with the youth. Like I mentioned earlier, the youth vote did not vote for the youngest candidate, which is counterintuitive. Also, Latin America still loves strong men. They don't want smart, quirky, technical people. It's just a fact.
Nerds.
Like, and this is what people tell you in the street, like keeping it 100. Like, I love Correa, but el que va a ser, like, él no es fuerte, I don't see him as that dude, So, I'm sadly people vote based on that too.
Yeah. So
that's also one thing that was a big impediment. Mainly it was all the efforts that the government made to not allow Correa to run and to oppose every another thing that they were allowed to run. Also, assembly members assembly member candidates for the National Assembly were actually persecuted. In Galapagos, there was no candidate for Correísmo, period, because of the different persecutions that they suffered. Galapagos being a protected area, everyone there is bound by these laws, and it's kind of virtually controlled by the government at all times, because you can't just go and build and make a business in Galapagos. You gotta go through a whole bureaucratic process because it's a protected area. So everyone who ran was pretty much saying, hey, if you run for Correísmo, you will not be allowed to do anything. And in a country like Ecuador, where government is king, well, what are you going to do? So they were essentially pushed out of running. In the province of Esmeraldas, the candidates were not accepted up until 2 weeks before the first round elections. It was a strong persecution where up to 2 weeks the candidacy was not allowed. In the U.S., something similar happened, where about 3 to 4 weeks before the election, the candidates were finally, officially written down as candidates and accepted by the CNE. So there are many, many things. In my own involvements and with campaigns inside of Correísmo in this election, being in Ecuador, being in Cuenca, in Guayaquil, in Manabí, in Cañar, in all these different places, being in the U.S. with the diaspora, I definitely have to say that there was no cohesive campaign. There was, you really have this inside struggle of the old school, of the old guard and the new guard coming in. And you also have a fake new guard that are just those that were put in by the old guard. They might be young in age, but they don't really represent anything new. So that's a mea culpa that we have to make on our side. And what does it mean to be Correísta? How much emphasis are we going to put on likes and on putting candidates that win? Because that's one big thing that Correísmo has been known for, is having this great apparatus of media and this great apparatus of political campaigns and strategists that, they'd say, well, this candidate's going to win versus that candidate, so put this candidate, without really thinking of what are their ideas, what do they represent, are they really entrenched in our beliefs, which is what happened. Case in point, Lenin Moreno. He was proposed as the candidate that would actually be able to win the election when compared to other Correístas, other people in the government, but the ideology wasn't there, the loyalty wasn't there. So that's definitely something that Correísmo and the left in general in Ecuador has to think about for the next couple of years. We have elections in 2 years for mayors, for prefects, for city council. So it's not all lost, but we really have to think hard about what happened. Where do we move from here? What does it mean to be a Correísta? Does it mean to be an anti-imperialist? Does it mean to be a leftist? Does it mean to be a center leftist? Of course, we want to be open to as many people as possible, but there has to be a clear ideology. One thing I do have to say before I close on this point is that Correísmo did an amazing battle with no money, all the legal impediments, and just the restrictions of COVID-19. I mean, we are a party, a movement that represents, and I include myself because I have supported this movement in these past elections, despite all the criticism that I might have of it. It is the most viable leftist movement that has proven to do something for the people in Ecuador, period. We do have to see what does it mean to be Correísta, and where does this take us forward?
That's such a great point, because I have this conversation with so many leftists in the U.S. who they love talking shit about Correísmo, and they love critiquing. A lot of ultras who are like, it's horrible, it didn't do anything. And of course, as people who are more on the revolutionary socialist Marxist perspective, we have our view of what could have been done better, this and that. But as you mentioned, compañero Ramon, in real life, in material reality, and I saw it with my own eyes, Correísmo, Alianza País, and the grassroots movement that they created was the strongest and best alternative. So instead of focusing on some imaginary party or group that, like, these 5 radical people in the middle of nowhere have the real revolutionary answers, support what actually exists in the real world here and there. And that is scientific socialism. It's understanding that not every socialist movement in a particular country is going to look exactly how you imagine it to be. It's going to take a form that's adapted to the conditions of that country. And it's our duty and our principle as revolutionaries, as socialists, to support that regardless of the contradictions going on. So I think that's a very mature analysis of Correísmo, of Alianza País. Camarada Zero, wrapping up with you, what do you think this recent election can teach us about Latin America in general, and the pink tide and the different movements across Latin America that have followed a similar path as Correa and Alianza País?
Well, I don't know. I think about these elections, and even though people might look at this as a defeat, I always think about like the words of the ex Bolivian vice president Alejandro Linera that says that revolutionaries during times of defeat, that's always the best time, because you get to supplement yourself, understand yourself more, and build the movement more, and start from where you began. So I feel like as of right now, what's going to happen in Ecuador and with the revolutionaries in Ecuador is that they're going to have a reformist moment amongst themselves. And like you said, Ramon, about what is Correísmo? Is Correísmo this like social democratic, like I was thinking about democratic socialism, like Bernie Sanders, where you just talk about like redistributing wealth? Or is it anti-imperialist, being sovereign, and trying to create a project where the people are part of that process in creating a new world, a new society for Ecuador? So I think that moving forward, this is where, like, Ramon said in the beginning, this is where like the real work starts for the revolutionaries. And, I hope the best for like the revolutionaries out in Ecuador and how they're able to like reform themselves, reshape themselves in this time.
Well said. And shout out to everybody watching, listening in Ecuador and the diaspora. Again, we spoke with Ramón Méndez Rivas, activist, political analyst from Acción Revolución. Make sure to go and show them some love on social media. They're a collective of Ecuadorians in the U.S. diaspora that supports progressive candidates and legislation in Ecuador. And we also had our comrade, Camarada Zero, Mr. Worldwide, currently in the 305 with the anti-imperialist vibe. We were in Nicaragua. We had a great time out there. He was in Colombia recently. Now he's in Miami. He got the Sandino mug. And it was really a pleasure to talk about Ecuador. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, Ecuador has a very special place in my heart because I live there. Some of the nicest people I've met are in Ecuador. And it has such a rich and beautiful revolutionary history that I think is underrated and not really mentioned much. But I'm confident that the Ecuadorian people are going to continue to resist Lasso. They're going to continue to rise up against neoliberalism, against capitalism, against imperialism, against racism, as they've done for so many decades. So, compañero Ramón and Camarada Zero, thank you so much for joining, and hope to talk to y'all soon. Peace out.
Peace.
Peace out.
Siempre, traidores nunca.
Traidores nunca. Take care, guys.